So, the Beatles announced this week that the 1964 Capitol US albums are being remastered and re-released. And I'm going to pass. Find out why. Stay tuned. Hey everybody, welcome to Northern Revolutions. I'm Rob. Welcome back if you're returning. Welcome if you're new. Beatles. Normally get excited when the Beatles put out something new. And this is interesting. They've announced that in honor of the 60th anniversary of their debut and their conquering of America, the 1964 Capitol albums will be released. So it's the discs released in 1964, including the double, interview Beatles story disc, being re-released, remastered, apparently direct analog audio transfer from the original master tapes, kind of exactly the same as what they did with the mono masters back in 2014. U.S. fans have been clamoring for years that they would like the Capitol albums re-released. They were done on CD, but they weren't the original U.S. masters. This is the original U.S. masters. Quick bit of info for folks that don't know. In 64, when the Beatles were cracking the U.S. market, the president of Capitol Records, a guy by the name of Dave Dexter Jr., not a Beatles fan, he was a jazz guy, thought that he could make the Beatles records sound better or more suited to the American market. He tweaked the recordings a little bit, added, some reverb and stuff. The albums were not mixed up, but they were tailored to the American market. Different cover artwork, different titles, different track listings. The track listing thing is because the way that royalties were paid, it was paid on a per track basis in North America, paid on a per album basis in the UK. UK albums had 2 more tracks than they had in America. So Capitol monkeyed with the albums, and thus everything up to Sgt. Pepper was different in North America than it was in England. Folks that experienced Beatlemania in North America in 1964, I completely understand why the versions of the albums that are considered the canon discography, if you will, the UK releases are not what they grew up with. So I get that. I completely understand. So these albums are being remastered, repackaged, new liner notes, but faithful reproduction of the packaging from 1964. Am I going to get it? No. Here's why. First, I don't have much interest in the American pressings. Let me explain. Nothing against them per se, but my biggest beef with them is that's not how the music was intended to be by the artist that made it. Ergo, my preference is always the UK versions because that's how the band intended the music to sound. And it's their music, not Dave Dexter Jr.'s music. So I always default to what the band wanted. I prefer the UK releases. Also, when I was getting into the Beatles in the early 90s, yes, I had some of the North American issues that were my dad's, but I didn't have all of them. And, early 90s, CDs. So I had all the Beatles albums on CD, which were the UK versions. So I grew up on the UK versions of the albums. And so that's what I want to hear. To me, hearing, the Beatles' second album doesn't really hold much appeal to me because I'm used to hearing With the Beatles or Beatles for Sale or Please Please Me as they had intended to be in England. So not a great desire for the US albums. The other thing is I'm not in the US. I'm in Canada, and the albums we had in Canada were a little bit different than they were in the US. Our president of Capitol Records in Canada charted his own path, and for the first 3 albums that were released in Canada, they were different than the US. And in fact, we released 3 before the States had issued 2. So our first 3 Beatles albums in North America. Beatlemania with the Beatles. It is the same as with the Beatles in the UK. We've modified the cover artwork slightly, but that's what it is, and it's from the UK master tape. This was actually the first Beatles album in all of North America, by the way. This even predates the VJ release. So this was our first Beatles record in Canada. Then we had Twist and Shout. This is basically Please Please Me. One or two tracks are a little different, but this is basically Please Please Me. This was the second album that we released. I mean, we were the only country to put it out in this form. And then our third album, Long Tall Sally. Yes, it looks like the Beatles' second album. The track listing is completely different. So even if I was interested in the North American versions, I would want the Canadian ones, not the US ones, just because this is what I had. This is what I did listen to. But again, even these don't hold a lot of appeal to me because I prefer the way that the band had intended them. So, the UK releases. Now, a couple years later, 65, 66, and even 67, we got those US albums that we didn't currently have. So there is a Canadian version of the Beatles' second album. Came out in 65, I think, not 64. We got the first album, Meet the Beatles. Came out, I think, again, 65, I think. And then our version of the early Beatles, which was released in the US, was released in Canada, but in 67. This is basically what's on the Twist and Shout record. So we got them, but a little bit later. We didn't really need them because we already had our versions. All of this to say, while I have all the Canadian versions, and I have the Canadian versions of the US albums, I don't listen to any of them. I did back in the day, but again, I was mostly listening to CDs just because I was out everywhere and I had my Discman with me. But I did listen to them on vinyl when I was home. But again, not to belabor the point, I keep going back to I prefer the UK versions. I don't want to listen to Dave Dexter Jr.'s, we'll call it unauthorized modification, if you will, of the albums. I want the albums as they were intended. So I absolutely understand why folks in the US, this is a great appeal to them. Or even, I could see, older Canadians, like some of my father's age that listen to those. I can see it because it's close. They're not going to reissue the Canadian albums. That's not going to happen. So I could see someone of my father's age, wanting these reissues. I get it. To me, they just don't hold any appeal. I don't need them. I have the originals if I want to listen to them. So I'm going to pass on them, which frees up money because, it's a box set. It's $290 something US, I think, is what Amazon's listing it for. That's money that I'm going to spend to finish rounding out my original UK first pressing collection. I almost have them all. I think I still need the White Album, and I still need Yellow Submarine, and I still need Let It Be. Those are the three. So I'm going to put the money towards getting those because that's something that I'm going to listen to. I'm going to appreciate more. So that's my thoughts. Maybe a hot take, but that's my reason for passing on it. I think it's great that they're putting it out because, Beatlemania in the US was a big deal. And for folks that were around back then and want the experience of what they heard back then, it absolutely makes a ton of sense. And I'm glad that it's being done, just not for me. That's all for me today, everybody. Let me know what you think in the comments. Are you interested in picking it up as a box set, or maybe they're going to do them individually? I don't know. But let me know in the comments what your thoughts are. That's everything for me today, everybody. Catch you on the flip side. Bye.